Hi, my name is Nishant Bajaria, and this is a quick video for my upcoming book with Manning Publications called Privacy Engineering. I'm super excited about this book because this book answers, I believe, one of the key questions for so many engineers, program managers, product managers, IT specialists, and security specialists all across the world, especially those who work in smaller, fast moving companies, even medium sized companies, or for that matter, even larger companies. You have a finite set of resources. You need to get products out the door, you need to build features, you need to monetize your data, and you need to do it pretty quickly. So time is pretty precious, resources are pretty limited. So that's kind of the world we all live in right now. And I've optimized this for small and medium sized companies, but really this is also a challenge for big companies too. And this is where I come in. I began my career in this space, in the identity, security, privacy space, about more than a decade ago. The goal at the time was, how do we make sign-ons more frictionless? How do we get more people on board? This was the time when people were getting onto the cloud for the first time. This is when global IDs were becoming more famous with Google and Facebook for the first time. Mobile computing was becoming a big deal. So at the time, the door was just starting to grow, and people were trying to build a platform to get more people onto their platform, if you will. And in that sense, it was more about, is this business going to work? At this point, more than 10 years out, there is no doubt that the business is working. More and more people are getting on the platform, people are getting on the tools, people are using their mobile devices all across the board. The data is streaming into the cloud. And now the attack vector has shifted completely. Now it's about, how do we make sure that this data is kept safe? How do we make sure that we build trust with our users? How do we make sure that the global regulations are followed? So somehow, with very, very quickly, you have gone from get everybody on the door and get their data to how do we make sure that their data is safe. It's almost like the middle period of just being able to collect data and caching it never existed, but really it did exist. There is a reason why Microsoft, Google, and AWS have huge cloud businesses. All those bills are being paid with cloud data that we collect, data that we store, data that we monetize, data that we join with other data from third party vendors. So we have a responsibility to make sure that the data is kept safe. And it's not just a good to have altruistic motive here. If we don't keep data safe, our ability to build trust with the customers is gone, which means customers' willingness to engage with us is gone, which means our ability to drive more engagement is gone. That's the kind of the bad perspective. The other perspective, which is equally bad, is that if people don't trust us to keep their data safe, their quality of engagement will not be very high, which means the quality of data we get from them will not be very high, which means they might give us data that is not correct, not reliable, not worthy of more engagement. And that is the foundational data upon which we build our engagement model. So we need to make sure that customers are kept safe on our platform, not just because of GDPR or CCPA or whatever law you've heard of. It's purely a business imperative to make sure that your data is kept safe. Now, in my upcoming book titled Privacy Engineering, we talk about its essential data protection all across the board. We talk about the relationship between security and privacy, why it's important that you look at security much more holistically. We look at privacy tech, all the upcoming books, all the upcoming privacy tools ranging from Big ID to Privatar to Privacera to Datadog to DataGrail to Wirewheel, all these tools. What do they mean? Should companies build or should companies buy these tools? That's kind of the use case here. I'm looking at the larger space in terms of regulation. What does GDPR mean? What does CCPA mean? Why are they different from each other? How are they different? What has the impact been of those laws on big companies versus small companies? Because remember, when these laws were passed, the prevailing sense in the regulatory climate was that there is a need to bring the big tech companies to heel. What has in fact happened over the last 3 years is that ever since these laws have become official, the big tech companies have done really well and the smaller companies have struggled. And that is because there is a bias in the law, not intentionally, but to make sure that you have more process, more rigidity, more demonstrable audit capabilities and whatnot. The big companies can do it pretty quickly because they have people like me on their payroll. What do small companies do? Companies where it's only one person doing IT, privacy, security, compliance, audit, right? It's very hard to do that. So this book is meant to be a weapon for those sorts of individuals. There is a significant investment in the book on data itself. How do you classify and inventory data? The whole purpose behind this is, when you collect customer data, you need to have a sense of what the risk level is attendant to the data itself. Is it high risk? Is it low risk? Is it medium risk, etc.? That's kind of the use case behind the data. How do you adjudicate that level of risk? How do you work with the engineering teams that collect the data, whose endpoints, API gateways are essentially the welcome mat for the data. How do you then talk to the data science folks, the data analysts who use that data to build ML models, to build the dashboards, who pry into the logs with their queries? How do you then work with the API vendors on the inside who get that data out to third parties and whatnot? How do you build out a lineage of data, not just from an ingest perspective, but an overall usage perspective, to ensure that the data gets used correctly? The way you do that is you build out automated detection controls, automated management enforcement controls. But that doesn't even begin to start unless and until you have a sense of what the data is. So there are 2 chapters that talk in detail about how you come up with classification. There's a lot of detailed examples to boot here. And then there's also a lot of detail in terms of how do you build out a categorization system? How do you inventory data at the database layer, at the bucket layer, at the row and column layer? How do you build out machine readable tags and affix those tags to the data to make sure that when any engineer makes decisions around that data, they do so with a proper understanding of what the data actually is. I've often been in the situation where people tell me if only engineers had the right context, they would make the right decisions. And that's true so far as it goes. But when you talk about engineers collecting petabytes of data, when you talk about them running hundreds and thousands of queries on a daily basis, a lot of these queries are even automated. Good intentions aren't enough. You need to make sure that the tooling, the automation, the logic is meshed into the data itself, so that when people make the decisions they do, 1,000 decisions per second sometimes, those can be constantly validated with a deterministic method with the data itself, right? So essentially, if you have if you're collecting somebody's biometric information, for example, and there better be a good use case for that. And I talk a lot about what GDPR talks about in terms of why you can collect somebody's data. Once you have that cleared away, you need to come up with a proper label that decides that this is identifying data that is very, very sensitive, that maps back to a specific individual. You come up with a tag for that. You affix that tag to the data in a way that can be read by processes and tools across the company, automated processes, by the way. How do you make sure that that penetrates across the board? And remember, as a company, when you start this process, you will be starting this with a ton of data under your bonnet already. In other words, you won't be starting from scratch. You'll be starting on third base or something, except it's not a positive third base. You have a ton of tech debt. So you have to make sure that culturally the company does the right thing from the get-go, in the sense where every bit of data collected this point forward is tagged, and every bit of data that you have collected already is tagged looking back. So you have to do a bunch of catching up to it. It's a bit like jumping on the treadmill that is already moving. You don't get a chance to set the incline and the velocity. You have to pretty much run, get your balance, burn your calories all at once. That's what this book helps you do. But this is very, very important, because as a small business, as a large business, as a medium-sized business, the key is you are moving fast, and you need to get these things going as quickly as possible, because the sooner you get this done, the easier your privacy program will be. It's like my colleague at Netflix used to say, my peer who reported to the company CISO like me would say, the best time to do things like these is yesterday, the second best time is today, the third best time is tomorrow, the worst time is later. So you want to make sure that you get these processes going as quickly as possible. The good thing is this book has explanation conceptually. It explains the tooling, it explains with examples, and it shows you how to take care of this end to end. This should be a helpful tool for all of you. The book also has a detailed chapter on data sharing, and we talk about how the New York Times journalists were able to track President Trump when he was having dinner with Prime Minister Abe of Japan. They were able to track his movements all across Mar-a-Lago, at the golf course, dinner with Prime Minister Abe. And the reason that happened is because somebody on the president's touring party, I believe it was a Secret Service agent, had a smartphone with an app on the smartphone that was broadcasting their location. So the president's location was not being broadcast, but the location of the Secret Service agent was being broadcast. And as a result, people were able to decipher where Mr. Trump was traveling across the board. Not just that, they were able to track a whole bunch of other people as well, because you can find out via third-party information, via internet information and whatnot, who else is in the party, and you can track them all the way through, simply because one person in the contingent was broadcasting their location information. So to that end, in that chapter, I've given examples of how data sharing is a reality, how we can share data in a way that protects privacy, so that the people who should be getting the data are able to get the data and are able to get it safely, securely, and able to use it correctly. But the people who aren't supposed to get the data, and if they manage to get a hold of it, how do you make sure that the data is privacy protected? In other words, you can obfuscate the data, you can round up beginning points, end points, you can round off starting points, end points. You can essentially obfuscate IP addresses, GPS locations, and whatnot. And collectively, that means rather than being the only person in the cohort with a specific set of values, you are now sharing that information with a whole bunch of other people. So as an example, rather than being the only people that began a trip at 11:03 p.m. and ended the trip at 11:50 p.m., you become one of 5 people that began the trip at 11 p.m. and one of 7 people that ended the trip at, say, close to midnight. By rounding off those starting points and endpoints, you now become part of a much bigger cohort rather than being a singular identified value, which becomes important because if you are, say, in a country that is targeting you for whatever reason, or you are being reached out in a way that you would not want to be reached out because you're being identified, these values allow a level of privacy protection. So there's that. There is a chapter on deletion. How do you delete data that is real-time account data in databases like Cassandra, MongoDB, as well as archival data in databases like Hadoop and Hive? How do you make sure that you overcome the append-only capabilities? How do you set up a service that schedules deletion and then sends a message to another API that collects the data so that you can mark deletions in a way that does not disrupt regular businesses, but at the same time enforces policies like retention, deletion, time periods, and whatnot? So you have the legal team setting policy, you have the privacy engineers building an API to schedule deletion, and then you have the service owners themselves who actually do the deletion of the data. So you have the shared responsibility model that I've explained in great detail. I've talked about a privacy review process. How do you automate a privacy review process ranging from the intake of the engineering proposals to the reviews themselves, to the elimination of privacy risks, to the mitigation tracking, to the criteria to allocate different levels of risk to different engineering projects. There's a ton of detail there on that front. Now, you can pretty much set up a program using the book. Now, the key is most of you will not be able to use the chapter as it is from a privacy review perspective because every company is different, every review process is different. What this chapter will do for you is it'll give you a pretty clear sense of what are the trade-offs, what are the value propositions, what are the use cases, and then you can essentially build it out from that point forward. And the hope is to give you enough information that you can avoid making some of the mistakes I made back in the day. At the same time, it gives you enough sort of beacons that you can emulate or avoid, if you will. These are the things that may or may not work for you. So that's kind of important as well. There is also a chapter on what is known as DSARs, which is data subject access requests. Because of GDPR and CCPA, customers, that is people who come to your website and whose data you have, now have the ability to ask you for a copy of their data. They can email you and say, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, so you want to check with your general counsel in your company or the legal teams or outside counsel, but they can email you and say, hey, company XYZ, give me a copy of all the data you have about me. How do you get that information? How do you get that data? How do you extract it? How do you come up with the time periods or look back periods? How do you transport the data? What security considerations apply? How do you decide what data is in scope of DSAR and what's not? So there is a chapter that discusses this in detail. Now, there are a ton of tools in the market that promise you DSAR capabilities. At the end of the day, though, only you know where your data lives. And there is a difference between a tool that packages data that you have extracted and a tool that actually locates the data for you in your data store. And that's what this chapter talks about. So I would strongly encourage you to look at this chapter in great detail as well. Another chapter that I've spent a lot of time discussing is the chapter on consents. My favorite example of a consent is when you and I were getting used to the internet for the first time in terms of e-commerce, maybe say 15, 20 years ago. Those of us in the US, when we would sign into accounts, we were basically given a checkbox saying that by clicking submit, I am essentially accepting the terms of use and privacy policy. Oftentimes, it wasn't even a checkbox. It was just text, which meant that by signing on to a website, we were essentially opting into marketing communication. At the same time, our counterparts in Europe had to explicitly check in the box, which means they were given the permission, they were given the flexibility where they could explicitly check in. And if they didn't check in, they were considered to have opted out. In the US, we didn't have that flexibility. Now, partly because of GDPR and CCPA, and partly because of industry movers like Apple themselves, the sentiment is shifting. Customers are considered to be opted out, and they would have to consciously opt in to be able to get marketing materials from the company, which means it gives customers the ability to decide how much communication they want from the company. Even more critically, it gives them the ability to consciously opt out of having their data collected, which is a huge win for privacy for those customers, because logic dictates that if you are preemptively opted in, you might not opt out and the company can collect your data, use that for personalization, monetization, things like that. The laws that are coming up now, and GDPR is just the beginning, my anticipation is there'll be a bunch of state level privacy laws in the US that will emulate GDPR, that will essentially give customers the same power. So now you as a company need to build a consent management program that locates customers' consent in a very accurate, timely fashion, and that gives you the confidence that you have the permission from the users to collect their data. and you have to make it easy for them to withdraw consent just as you do for yourself to get their consent. So that's pretty important as well. So now in this use case, you are looking to make sure that you do right by yourself and your customer. So there's a lot of code, a lot of examples, a lot of insights in that consent management chapter. There is also a chapter on security, specifically from an AppSec or platform security, product security perspective. Vulnerabilities around shared password, lack of multi-factor authentication, weaknesses, secrets, and identities in the code. How do all that lead to security risks, which in turn lead to privacy risks? So when the book comes out, the Colonial Pipeline hack that took place very recently may have receded into memory. But the fact of the matter is, based on current information, the Colonial hack happened because they didn't have multi-factor authentication, and there was a compromise of an account that was being used for VPN purposes. So you basically had an account and a password get compromised, the identity and the password get compromised. The corresponding account was not being used, but was also not disabled as it probably should have been. It was not in scope of an MFA as it should have been. And as a result, an outside exfiltrator was able to get into the Colonial Pipeline and shut down gas supply for so many states in the East Coast, and gas prices went up. This could happen to food supply. This could happen to electric supply. This could happen to banking. So certain privacy risks at the application platform infra layer become privacy risks, because once somebody gets into your system and becomes a pseudo admin, they can increase their privileges. They can essentially operate into your account as if they are your account themselves. Essentially, they can act as the admin. They can impersonate a customer. Malware, phishing, spam, everything's on the table. And at some point, any level of security risk becomes a privacy risk as well. So I have a chapter that covers that in detail. In the chapter, I also talk about how certain efforts that help security hurt privacy. So in some cases, you improve security, you improve privacy. But in some cases, you improve security, but you hurt privacy. So where are the examples where there is tension? So I've talked about that as well. And then, of course, there is a last chapter that talks about things like advertising, talks about things like the changes Google is making on the third-party cookies side, why it's important for companies to increasingly pay attention to regulators, why it's important to build this community of people that are privacy and security advocates, because this is a brand new field that when you can hire somebody with, like, say, 15 years of experience in iOS, because it has been that long since Steve Jobs walked on stage with his hipster mug, we don't have that level of bench on the security and privacy side. So it's important to build a community and have government, think tanks, industry work together. So there's a chapter that talks about that. My hope overall is that when you work for a company that has historically optimized for growth, for engagement, for customers, and is now suddenly confronting this tremendous challenge on security and privacy, how do you get started? How do you make sure that you're on the right track? How do you quantify those risks? How do you start measuring progress? How do you build the work going forward? How do you optimize for improvements? How do you scale for maturity? How do you build a program around it? And how do you do all this without creating a whole bunch of burdensome process, without slowing down your engineers who are legitimately trying to build a better product, right? So that's what this book is about. It's about helping your business without hurting privacy. It's about growing privacy without hurting your business. There is a way where you can do both at the same time. That's what this book is about. It's a book intended for engineers, but I believe it'll help product managers, compliance specialists, attorneys, people in media, executives, everyone, because I feel like the gap between the engineers, their day-to-day life on the one side, and the business's strategic goal on the other is where privacy risk begins. The larger the gap, the larger the privacy risk. And this book is aimed at a doorstop between those risks, if you will. So my hope is start with the engineers in your company, but beyond that, make sure that everybody in the company reads this book, because there is something in it for everyone. There are chapters in the book that may not apply to you. Some chapters will, some chapters may not. But then there are others in the company for whom those other chapters will be helpful. So this is a book for everyone. My strong advice is please read it, because it has a lot of lessons I learned the hard way. Because when I got into the cybersecurity field, none of this existed. The lessons didn't exist, the learnings didn't exist, the tutorials didn't exist, but the risks were not that high. Now we have a lot more resources, a lot more talent, but the risk vector has gone up. The attackers have gone up in number, the amount of data has gone up, the fines have gone up, the scrutiny has gone up as well. So this book is aimed at making sure that people land on their feet, that they can keep growing, and then they can respect their customers' data and help their business at the same time. My name again is Nishant Bajaria. You can find me on LinkedIn. The book's name is Privacy Engineering by Manning Publications. Thank you very much for listening.